Hi, I'm Regan Robinson, your host of Future Fit, the only podcast unraveling the secrets of how the world's most innovative leaders stay future ready in a fast-paced world. I've spent over 20 years as a futurist and strategist, transforming top global brands and putting investment-backed startups on paths to sustainable growth. Along the way, I've become obsessed with new ways to prepare for the future, because thinking about the long term once a year simply isn't enough. In each episode, I talk with movers, shakers, and path breakers who share their stories about how they turn uncertainty into their strategic advantage. Throughout our journey, we'll discover unconventional and imaginative ways to help you thrive today while leading your teams into tomorrow. Future Fit leaders know that being prepared for what's next is more than a business decision. It's a way of being. Let's venture together as we co-create a new future readiness playbook. The future can't wait, and neither can I. So, are you ready to get future fit? So today I'm thrilled to welcome Aaron Edwards, a founder, investor, and board member with a deep understanding of intrinsic value and multiple years of experience building relationships with small to high-end clients and brands. Aaron is renowned for having a strategic and operational skill set that maximizes potential and is CEO of the Charles Group, a global award-winning full-service agency focused on strategic campaigns, brand storytelling, and digital experiences. The Charles Group has received numerous top industry accolades from the Webby Awards and Fast Company, among many others, and has worked with numerous iconic brands such as Cartier, Omega, Roc Nation, and HP. Aaron is a member of the board of advisors at Pace University's Leuven School of Business and is a limited first close partners, a company that backs venture funds owned by underrepresented managers that have been historically underrepresented, especially but not solely in the venture capital industry. Aaron is leading change and transformation in an intentional and purposeful way, and so I'm incredibly excited to hear what he's going to enlighten us with today. Welcome to the show, Aaron.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Likewise. So let's get this show on the road with the question that I ask all of my guests, which is, what does future ready mean to you?
Good question. I think they're two interesting words, aren't they? Future and ready. I don't think anyone's ever ready for the future, if I'm going to be really honest. I think you can have a plan, a strategic goal or a goal or set of objectives, but I think the preparation is something that I constantly think about daily. So yes, we think about the future and what that could be, but we're really thinking about the now and what we're doing now. To set ourselves up. So from our perspective, as an agency, we're constantly looking at technology, different ways to improve our business model, iteration, taking bits of what we think have worked with some things and finding ways to iterate on top of that, and just really being able to receive feedback in a way that allows you to then make pivots and adjust very quickly. So for me, future ready is being able to be equipped to do all of those things in real time. Yeah. And that ultimately will accelerate the growth of the business or the company, hopefully for the future.
Yeah, that really resonates with me, because what I always share with leaders is future readiness it's not an annual activity that you check off your list. It's not a one and done thing. It's actually a mindset, a capacity, and a capability, or a way of being. And it's my personal view that the only way you can actually be future ready is if it's continuous, iterative. It's something that you're actually doing every day. And what people are sometimes shocked to realize, especially when I work with them on a more continuous basis, is once you start to build the capacity and the mindsets, then it becomes an intrinsic capability. And it's not, it's just who you are and how you move through the world. And so then in order to accomplish or to bring together all those elements that you just mentioned, it actually becomes a lot easier, which I think people don't really realize.
100%. I wish I'd have told myself that 10 years ago, right. Keep iterating, keep doing the things wrong. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So building on that, one of the biggest mistakes leaders make is focusing on the short-term pressures that really provide immediate benefits, but
Mhm.
ultimately undermine long-term success and sustainability. Now, there are a lot of reasons why this happens, but it is my very strong view that short-termism is a disease, as I like to say, that causes companies to fail or decline. And while you can make money off a declining business model for years, data shows that once a company runs up against a major stall in its growth, it has less than a 10% chance of fully recovering. Now, you've said that the battle between short and long-term goals makes for a challenging agency environment. And so I'm curious, how are you approaching balancing the immediate needs with future growth at the Charles Group? And what approaches or practices help you navigate this ongoing tension?
Very good question. The readiness element, I think, is actually super relevant to the future piece that we were just describing. So short term versus long term and being
Mhm.
future ready. So I think that last statement really applies to what you're describing now. For me, my background is finance. I worked as a commodity trader for a while in valuations analyst at an investment bank. So my view very much comes from like a macroeconomic economics background, like how do we think about what's happening in price elasticity of the demand, dynamic pricing models? How do we think about, what's going on in the cycles where industrials are versus value trade versus equity? So I think from that perspective, the view is to have a view, right? Having a POV on what you think the environment looks like is really key to then being able to risk manage throughout that turbulent period. Nobody can predict the future, but what
Right.
you can do is be prepared to be able to move at the speed that's required, but also to be able to have a vision or a path to say, well, we're not going to get distracted by X, Y, and Z because maybe that distraction isn't going to be good for our business. So for
Right.
us specifically, what we're looking at literally right at this minute is how do we start to consolidate our sector concentration and actually become a little bit more focused in three specific sectors. Now they are wide and big, but what it will do is it will eliminate a lot of other things that we have been doing. You
Mhm.
might look at that and say, well, oh, revenue attrition, is that a good thing to do in this like uncertain economic environment? But
Mhm.
then we'd have the hypothesis or the thesis of, well, we think economically speaking, these industries are going to grow way faster than the others.
Mhm.
So they all kind of support each other. There's a diversification element to this, but we're not going to spread ourselves too thin. We're going to become a little bit more focused.
Yeah.
So I
So,
think
oh, go
you
ahead.
have to be able to endure the pain of making a decision in the short term for the
Yeah.
long term gain. Yeah.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're constantly revisiting what this point of view or hypotheses are. You literally said two of my favorite words that I'm always trying to help leaders understand. A vision and a strategy is not a plan. Those are two very, very different things. And there's not one possible future. There are multiple possible futures. And so that's why it's important to have a point of view in terms of the role you think your company can play in the future and work from the future back, but also to have
Mhm.
several hypotheses about how that vision might emerge from the present. And it very much
Mhm.
sounds like that's the approach that you're taking.
Correct. And I'm looking at this business in 10 years from now. People are looking at AI and saying 2, 3 years from now, we're not going to be in having jobs and there's going to be so much market disruption for advertising, yada, 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 yada. And I'm going, well, what's past that? What's beyond that? Right?
Right.
What's beyond the panic? And how do we structure our business in a way that's going to survive that time period? Because 2 to 3 years is nothing in the
Right.
scape of a business's
Totally.
lifetime.
Yeah.
So
Well, I think it's this fear and this ego. Two of my other favorite words that I talk about a lot that I think really plays into it. And we'll get into this in my last question, but the market advertising has been in disruption for 30 years, people. Like,
right,
open your
right.
eyes. This is not
Mhm.
new. And it's
No,
just the scale, the scope, where it's happening is that is modern business. And
no.
so it sounds like you're doing a really great job of not getting distracted by the shiny objects and like spending
Yeah.
too much energy, or you're actually you're not letting the fear or the ego get in the way. You're like, no, okay, how can I use this to my advantage and think about it
Mhm.
from a short-term perspective as well as a long-term perspective.
Yeah. And if you look at the data, I think over the last 100 years, don't quote me on this, but I think there's a statistic that is something like the advertising industry has grown CAGR wise, so compounded annual growth over the last 80 years at 1%, right? Which is an incredibly low growth rate.
I
Now,
was
what
gonna
people
say it
don't
sounds pretty low.
people think they're like, well, what do you mean digital advertising in Google and Facebook? And it's no, the advertising dollars are shifting from TV into digital, but they're not getting bigger, right?
Right,
So this is not an industry that I don't think is in a massive decline. It's just a shift. And the
right.
question just becomes, where is the shift happening and how are you figuring out to move with the shift and the changes of this specific cycle?
Absolutely. That's a beautiful transition into my next question. So let's talk about data or cultural insights. So tapping into culture means understanding and leveraging those underlying currents in society and human behavior to introduce innovations that challenge the status quo and redefine markets. Now, the Charles Group builds, grows, and transforms brands. And you've said, I love this, that you turn desire into demand. But I'm curious how you're applying this perspective to adapting and innovating your services, or even how you're evolving your internal culture. So, how do you stay attuned to emerging cultural trends and changing societal values that could influence the Charles Group future? And how are these insights informing what your clients or employees might need in the future?
Yeah, so again, fantastic question. I think there's lots of different questions in that question as I was listening to it. So thank you for giving me a hard one. But yeah, I think where I'm going is like there is kind of a nuance in understanding how the trends form and why they exist. And sometimes there is no rhyme or reason. I think the way that data exists today in so many different places, you can use a lot of tools to scrape information. We call it data extraction. And that
Mhm,
data extraction process really allows us to develop what I like to call like a psychological profile of people's behaviors, consumption
mhm,
habits, ways of thinking. And so it reminds me a little bit of behavioral finance, right? Behavioral finance is very much focused on the psychology of the financial markets. That's how
mhm.
I see advertising, right? It's just you're in this massive world of people's need states and wants
Right.
and desires and fears. And so our job is to figure out what are the positive emotional triggers that we're going to create with a certain piece of advertising or creative or a really tactical plan that hits somebody in a way that makes them feel like they want or need this product. And so that all comes from that psychological kind of evaluation, all of the data to support that. And then to back up what I was saying earlier, it's the thesis. It's the what is your supporting statement or idea or argument or dissertation maybe
Yeah,
on
there's a
why
million
you
synonyms
think
for it.
yeah, this specific idea works better than others. And what I love about what we do is you have the ability to go and test that. You can build
Yeah.
measurement frameworks and measurement plans that say, did the things that put this really smart plan together happen? Did they actually do the things we wanted them to do? And if they didn't, why didn't they? And if not, how do we then learn to then adapt and shift and pivot our
Mhm,
messaging, our strategy, or our tactics? So
mhm,
that's how we think about insights and then ultimately how that translates into the creative and digital work that we do.
mhm. Yeah, amazing. Yeah, I use many similar tools as well, whether that's empathy or empathy mapping frameworks when working with leaders to sketch out their long-term roadmaps. But what I find is it can be difficult because it involves anticipating future needs and challenges that actually aren't evident yet, right? And so while
Mhm.
data can provide insights into current trends and behaviors, its predictive power actually diminishes over
Yes.
longer time horizons, right? So the further out we anticipate, the more variables and uncertainties we have to contend with. It gets harder, right? And so that's why
Yes.
I always encourage people to adopt a range of practices, whether that's trend analysis and scenario planning, customer co-creation, continuous
Mhm.
learning. And then I also just would add that I think it's important to keep confirmation bias in mind. When you
Yes.
focus
Yeah.
too much on data that supports existing beliefs or strategies, you overlook the signals that could
Yes.
suggest alternative need states or futures. And so I think it's important
Yeah.
for our listeners to keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Biases will get you every time.
They will, and also one really interesting point on that is the simplicity sometimes of it. The most difficult job of any business owner, strategist, person is how do I simplify the
Yeah.
messaging or the framework or whatever it is so that people actually understand what the hell it is that we're doing. So we talk in this very complicated way, but our
Hmm.
goal as an agency is always to say, how do we make this so simple the client says, aha, why haven't we thought of that before? That's just such an obvious idea.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah, that resonates with me too, because I feel like I have to, sometimes I'm called a crazy mad scientist. And so I have
right.
to kind of go there. Yeah. Or like they call me a beautiful mind, John Nash, because I'm like, when I start drawing things and people are like, what is going on here? But
Yeah.
I have to go through that process of getting the sausage made or whatever you want to
Yep.
say, getting it a little clear for myself. But then you
Yeah.
still have to take several steps to really simplify it, especially when you're trying to create a, whether that's creative or a future scenario that is just, people are not open to it for whatever reason. So simplicity is definitely key.
100%.
Yeah. So let's dig a little deeper about sort of growth and transformation. So what I love about growth, transformation, and future readiness is they're actually all linked, right? Growth provides the resources for transformation. Transformation ensures future readiness, and future readiness then fuels growth. So together they create this synergistic cycle or flywheel that enables companies to thrive in a world that never stands still. And FYI, everybody never will. You haven't figured that out yet, right? And so the Charles Group has the track record of really successfully growing and transforming brands for your clients. Though again, I'm curious how you might look at this through the lens of your company's future. So what does growth and transformation mean to you? And how are you approaching this to keep the Charles Group ahead of the curve?
Ooh, what does growth and transformation mean to me? I think like there is the revenue side and the number side, right? There is the financial side to growth, which I don't think we should underestimate. Interestingly, I just did a whole vision strategy presentation to senior executive leadership team at the company, and the simple question came from my co-founder Sam and sister. He's
Yeah, I
like,
was gonna say
"Okay,
your sister.
this is all amazing, great. What is the goal?" Right? And
Yeah.
it was yeah, I actually have it, but I didn't put it in the deck, but I wrote it down on a piece of paper.
Uh-huh.
And they were top line revenue number, profitability number, and then a specific statistic around employee retention and tenure.
Mm-hmm.
And she was like, yeah, but these are all financially driven metrics. Surely the goal should be to be bigger than that. And I
Mm-hmm.
was like, interestingly, you can tie back every single plan, tactical thinking, strategic road mapping thing to these very simple three metrics. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what we should be focusing on as an organization is saying, well, if we do this right and we get HR right and we get our culture right and we think about the way in which we're growing with intentionality and we do this within this time period, we will hit all of the things that we're trying to achieve by being the best leaders, by being the most empathetic people, by trying to
Mm-hmm.
build a culture that's one of a kind. All of that will come because there's no way you can build a company of that scale and size without having those things together.
Right, right.
So for me, I do think having a very, very clear directive on the financial metrics that you like want to place importance to and say exactly how you're going to get there. And then everything from that really stimulates how you're going to work as an organization. Have
Mm-hmm.
an expectation to hit a 40% margin, then your business needs to be global. It needs to have offshoring, nearshoring. You need to have technology heavily embedded because the level of optimization required, the level of efficiency required to run at
Yeah.
that level is going to be incredibly paramount, right? So, but
Ah.
that's a very different organization to say an organization that says, no, we want to run at 15% margin because
Mm-hmm.
we want to do X, Y, and Z. And okay, that's a very different culture, and maybe we're less focused on technology. So I think the numbers can explain a lot of kind of how you want to get there. And I think from a growth perspective, that's how we're thinking. Culture, obviously slightly different, but I think that growth and culture kind of work hand in hand.
Right,
The growth can't happen without the culture, and the
right.
culture can't happen
Not the
without the growth,
people. Yeah,
right? Because the people don't feel like they're developing and they're growing inside an organization. They don't feel like the organization is moving fast enough and creating enough. They're stagnating, they're gone. So I
yeah.
feel like the engine that you build for the culture is going to be really key to achieving the growth of the
Yeah.
business.
Yeah. So it sounds like, again, for you, it's also going back to the business model and the financial model and like, what are the toggles that we need to like turn on and off, but really looking at it holistically from a numbers perspective, which I have to admit, so I'm obsessed with financial models. We could sidebar that in another day, but like, what I find, again, having worked in a lot of agency environments myself, there's not a lot of leaders that are having this conversation or comfortable there with this type of conversation from a strategic standpoint. You might have the CFO, but that person is not, they're not thinking about the culture. They're not thinking because the work that happens in an agency environment comes down to the talent, period.
Correct. Yeah,
Right.
correct.
And
100%.
to do the caliber of work that your company is doing, it requires having the top talent. And this will be a great segue into my next question. Before I get there, one of the things that I was really excited about in talking to you is how intentional you are about recognizing that. I was listening to you on a podcast and you were talking about how burnout, this culture of high performance was
Mm,
like contributing to burnout. And not only was it was impacting turnover, which in the agency biz, if you will, is significant. But the
yeah.
fact that you even openly discussed that to me was
Right.
why I've left the agency world. Not gonna
Right.
lie. But you
Right.
know what I'm
Right.
saying? Because I was like, I can't keep doing this. I have a risk for cancer. Again, that's inspired my whole mission. That's a whole other podcast conversation. But I think that's really interesting that you are mapping over not only the numbers, but the culture, where I find that people tend to just look at one or the other. But you really have
Mhm.
to look at both of those and see how they work together and what do you need to dial up and dial down in order to continue to transform and grow.
Yes, 100%.
I love that. So speaking of internal culture, so I loved your manifesto, which really resonates with me because it's all about breaking the rules,
Yeah.
embracing chaos, and being fearless. We talked about that in our warm-up conversation, actually, right? And these are
Yeah.
really all essential for cultivating a company's future readiness, right? Because future readiness is about challenging the status quo. And the companies who are prepared to question, learn, and adapt,
Yeah.
those are the ones that are going to thrive. And so, how are you getting your team to embrace this kind of culture that we've been talking about? And what's maybe been the most challenging or surprising about it?
I think there's quite a few different, like, culture is such a difficult word to wrap your head around, especially when you talk about an organization's culture, right? Because some people will look at that and say, well, what's the benefit plan, right? And they think that's a culture.
Yeah,
Or they
right.
look at what's the happy hour situation on a Thursday and how do I get treated when I go traveling? And for me, it's like what I'd like to coin it, and it's not a term I have coined at all, but it's the employee experience. So we as leaders, we think about how would we want to be treated in an organization? And the question becomes, how would we feel if these were the things that were being said about us in these reviews, in these performance, discussions, in these ways of working, SOPs, and all of that fun stuff. And so
Mm,
what we've defined really is like a accountability measure, right? Which is if you are senior in the organization, we put a lot of trust in your ability to do your job. And so
mm,
we're not interested in trying to micromanage. We're not interested in trying to tell you how to do it. We just expect results. And when you don't perform, then the question becomes, all right, well, there's a difference in a mismatch in expectation. Let's have an open dialogue and a conversation about that. And let's
mm.
get clear on what the priorities are because maybe we weren't clear. Maybe your onboarding wasn't great. Maybe the person that
Yeah.
you were working with just isn't a great employee. They're not a high performing person and you are. So we spend the time to really get to know the people. And then once they're in and once they're able to feel comfortable having that conversation with you, it just opens up a whole new dynamic in the relationship.
Yeah.
But that doesn't exist inside an organization. Unfortunately, if we could, we would do this with every single employee. The reality is we don't. So what we try to say is how do we treat our senior folks as best as they would like to be treated, which then has a
Mhm.
knock-on effect on how they then
Right.
treat people inside of the organization too. I think having a robust HR practice, specifically around people operations, is key. Regular check-ins, things that are not part of the review cycle, but more
Mhm.
pastoral, understanding people's personal issues. And that's not saying that we want to know what happened at your family's wedding last weekend, but sometimes being able to confide in a colleague or a partner or in a senior leader about something that's happening in your personal life has a massive effect on the way that they can help you as an organization. Take some time. Maybe we're not doing this at this time. Maybe you don't need to be on these calls. And so it's just a state of management and it's active and it's proactive. And I think that's ultimately what you need to do to build a culture that can survive the test of time. And that's what we're ultimately trying to build at this organization.
Yeah, well, I just want to highlight something that I think you said that it was actually like blew my mind for a moment there. And I think it's pretty revolutionary when you started to talk about how you have a conversation around the potential for the misalignment of expectations. That's pretty mind-boggling, I'm saying in the best possible way, because as I reflect on the numerous FTE jobs that I've had, I'm like, wow, like how we could have course corrected if the hiring,
Mhm.
I'm always hired by the C-suite, if as a senior leader on a team, if we would have said, oh, maybe we both weren't exactly clear, because that's okay. Like dynamics change. It's not like a finger pointing exercise. But the fact that you're willing to have those conversations and take accountability for like, hey, maybe we weren't clear. Or, and how can we get everything out on the table so that we can move forward in a new way? I think is actually pretty revolutionary.
Well,
So hats off.
don't put me. Don't interview my senior folks just yet.
No, I'm like, wow, I'm pretty like that gives me hope, right? That people are that you're willing to have those kinds of conversations because at the end of the day, everybody has a million things going on. And the more that we can all be vulnerable and just get to the truth, I'm very big on just openness and transparency because I feel like a lot of the other sort of stuff that happens in the workplace is part of what's getting in the way. It's slowing the work down, right?
100%.
So,
That's exactly what it is.
yeah,
100%. And it's like the barrier to good work is communication 99% of the time. It's why we're
absolutely.
not a 200 person organization too, right? There's a reasoning as to why we've decided to limit our size as a company because the reality is you can't manage the way that you would like to when you're 150 people. It's just not the same thing. So
Yeah, totally. So I talked about this a little bit earlier, but the marketing and advertising industry has been in a state of disruption for at least the past 3 decades, probably longer, driven by a myriad of interconnected forces. So whether that's changes in tech, the competitive landscape, consolidation, globalization, service commoditization, like changes in the employee expectations or employee experience. I love that. That's great. So the vibes are off, right? And they have been for a while. As I read a quote somewhere, this is not mine, but I love it. The past is gone, the present is chaos, and the future is flux. I was like, ooh, I like that.
like
Right? So proactive approaches to reimagining or innovating your business models more important than ever today, right? Especially when research shows that the average business model lifespan today is between 3 and 5 years, down from about 15 years 50 years ago, right?
yeah.
And so I'm curious, what gaps or difficulties are you facing when anticipating and strategizing for the Charles Group future? And what wisdom could you offer for leaders who are struggling with similar challenges?
Yeah, I think the market volatility and the client spend contraction in the short term to midterm is what causes, I think, panic. And the ripple on effect or knock on effect on that then ends up affecting the wider businesses in from an economics perspective. And so I think What you have to do as a leader is be calm and still, and actually, rather than get tied up in the chaos and the pivots and the repivots of the strategy, you actually have to do the opposite. You have to stick to your guns a little bit. You have
Hmm.
to be willing to make sacrifices. Sometimes those are people, sometimes those are lifestyle choices. You have to be okay with that because in order to survive, you do have to make tough decisions. I think most business leaders today see the flashy lifestyles on Instagram and on LinkedIn about how they scaled their business and raised $1 billion and they're now a unicorn. And that is a 0.00001% of
Yeah,
the business community.
right.
And if you speak to some of the most established people in business, they've been doing it for 40, 50 years. They
Yeah,
didn't make it overnight.
yeah,
So I think that is the wisdom that I have, which is things take time, be prepared to hunker down. But when things are chaotic, that's usually a sign that there's opportunity. And sometimes I think some of the
absolutely.
best companies come from chaotic periods of time or
Yeah.
times where things aren't thriving. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
that really resonates with me. When you said the stillness, the presence, like I always say, foundational to my work is well-being. Like being well is the foundation of working well. And so that's why my show is called Future Fit. It's no
Mhm.
secret because I draw a lot of health analogies because I feel that in order to be fit to face and thrive in the future, fitness is it's everywhere, right? It's mental fitness, it's physical fitness, it's financial fitness. And if you
Mhm.
actually are take care of yourself and prioritize well-being in all of its forms, it goes just beyond the physical and the mental, then you will actually be fit to face the future and the changes and the perseverance that we talked about in our warm-up chat. And it's just it's so important. And investing in emotional intelligence and really developing your own emotional intelligence and that of your team. Actually, all of these things can be a strategic advantage, right?
Mhm.
Like if you're
100%.
well and your team is well, that everybody else is running around harried and and
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
can tell when I meet people, and I can very much tell from you who have this sort of centeredness and this calmness. I think is it's not only refreshing, but it is truly a competitive advantage. So I love that. Now, is there anything else you'd like to add before I bring our conversation to a close?
No, this has been great. You've asked some fantastic questions and really have me thinking. So yeah, I think this has
I
been a
love
really good.
that. I
Yeah.
love that. So, a
Yeah.
final question before you share where listeners can find out more about you. In your view, is preparing for the future more about managing risks or capitalizing on opportunities?
Oh, it's both, right? I don't think it's one or the other. I think you have to take the opportunity and you have to have a zero risk mindset, meaning there is no risk, just take it and figure it
Yeah.
out. I think at scale, you have to risk manage. You cannot run a business without a robust risk management process or evaluation criteria for
Yeah.
your
Well, what
company.
comes up for me with as something I always share with leaders is you have to realize that two seemingly opposed concepts can
Yeah.
exist at the same time, and you have to be able to develop that ambidextrous mindset.
Yep.
That is
That's
key.
exactly.
Both things can be true. It's and or
That's exactly
thinking and plus. It's not either or. And it sounds like
correct.
you're very much of that ilk as well. And with that, where can people go to find out more about you and your work in the Charles Group?
Yeah, you can go to www.thecharlesgrp or nyc.com and you can follow me on LinkedIn at Aaron C. Edwards with the LinkedIn tag. So yeah,
Marvelous.
always on LinkedIn. I always like to try and post things that are semi-controversial, so you'll see me commenting a lot on people's BS comments. So yeah.
I love that. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time and your brilliant insights, Aaron. It's been enlightening, and I've had so much fun exploring with you today.
Oh, me too. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Future Fit. If you're listening, you're probably future curious. So follow me in my newsletter on LinkedIn to keep the conversation going and share your discoveries with the Future Fit community. And if you enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe, rate, and review Future Fit on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time.